So we are here at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. My name is Atosa Sultani. I'm the global coordinator for the Amazon Sacred Headwaters Initiative. The initiative is an alliance of 30 indigenous nations in Ecuador and northern Peru who are working to protect 35 million hectares of rainforest, an area the size of Italy, in the headwaters of the Amazon, together with the 30 indigenous nations who are members of the alliance. And we're happy to be here hosting this conversation about how funders and indigenous peoples can work better together, how we make sure that funding reaches the ground, how we make sure that indigenous peoples are able to receive, direct, channel, and benefit from funding that's dedicated to climate and conservation. This has been an area that's been lacking. So we're here today having this conversation with funders. Joining me will be Hub Culture, who's hosting it. Thank you for Hub Culture for hosting this event. Also, Rainforest Foundation, the Christensen Fund, and also the Sacred Headwaters Initiative. So thank you for being here today. I'm going to pass it around so we can do a quick introduction, starting with you.
I'm Stan Stoliker, and welcome back to the Hub Culture Pavilion at Sharm el-Sheikh, COP27. We're talking about Indigenous funding, the relationships between donors and funding, and the solutions that we all need to drive this forward. A special edition, a special episode in collaboration with La Amazonia Habla, podcast collaboration here in Sharm el-Sheikh. I'm Stan Stoliker for the Hub Culture Chronicles.
My name is Torbjørn Jefsen. I work for as a forest finance advisor with the Rainforest Foundation Norway, which is an organization that supports about 60 indigenous or environmental organizations across the Amazon, the Congo Basin, and Southeast Asia.
I'm Casey Box. I'm the Director of Global Strategy at the Christensen Fund, which is a private foundation based in California that directly supports the rights of indigenous peoples. We are a rights-based funder, and the guiding document for all of our philanthropic activities is the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
Go ahead.
So my name is Jesus Chavez. I'm the head of global communications at the Sacred Headwaters Initiative, and I'm just driving the media strategy for the organization worldwide.
Buenos días con todos. Amigos, mi nombre es Domingo Peas, soy indígena Chua de Ecuador. Este momento estoy como coordinador territorial del programa COICA Sagrados Territorios de Vida, que es un programa de la Convención IEDC.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Domingo Peas. I'm an Achuar indigenous leader from Ecuador, and I'm the Territories Coordinator for the Amazon Sacred Headwaters Initiative, Territories for Life, which is an initiative, a joint initiative of CONFENIAI and IDESEP, the two indigenous federations of Ecuador and Peruvian Amazon. So while we are here hearing about many pledges, many efforts to support indigenous peoples in the front lines, what we are seeing is that there's challenges to meeting those promises. You know, in Glasgow, there was 1.7 billion committed to indigenous peoples and their climate and biodiversity solutions. Another 17 billion was committed to forest protection and getting to zero deforestation. A year later, we're not seeing much difference in the terms of getting funding to the ground. There are many reasons for that. I wanted to start with Torbjørn, with you. You've just released a report that looks at this very issue, how we're doing in terms of getting funding to the ground, what are the barriers, and what are the recommendations. So I want to give you the floor to describe a little bit about your findings and your recommendations.
Thank you, Atosa. Let me start by giving you a little bit of a big picture first. So last year, the Rainforest Foundation Norway published a report that we called Falling Short, which was the first time we were actually, we or anyone else I think, able to figure out exactly, or pretty exactly, how much international donor support that goes to support the tenure rights or the forest management of the indigenous peoples and local communities across the tropics. And what we found was that in the 10 years from 2011 to 2020, they had received about $270 million on average per year. And we also found that there were very few donors globally that were actually supporting this. It was a small selection of bilateral donors that were putting considerable money into this, and some selected philanthropies like the Christensen Fund, who are here, and Ford Foundation. But other than that, there wasn't that many that was actually contributing. And we also saw that this figure, $270 million, that's in the same period, it was about a little less than 1% of the total climate aid. Which is interesting also because the money that we looked at, that comes from many different sources, not just climate, also biodiversity funding, human rights funding, agricultural aid, etc. And yeah, it's a very stark underinvestment compared to how important indigenous peoples, local communities, forest management is. We know that 36% of the key biodiversity areas are in lands claimed by indigenous peoples or local communities, and at least 25% of the above ground carbon is stored in forests that they have claims to. And also that the forests under legally recognized indigenous or local community protection is mostly better at preserving both biodiversity and the carbon that is stored in these forests. So as you pointed to earlier this year, we did another study that looked a bit closer at what are the problems with the current funding system, what are the barriers that indigenous organizations are facing in accessing this funding. And what we found there was that there's a low share of this overall $270 million that actually has, indigenous leadership connected to it. We found that only 17% of the total funding went to projects that even had a mention of an indigenous organization in the project description. So it's an indication that there is, not so much indigenous leadership there. And that the funding had predominantly gone through the large international organizations or UN agencies, multilateral institutions, and many of these often have weak ties to indigenous or local community organizations. We also saw that national organizations there was a channeling more support of the support that reach national organizations that go to indigenous organizations. So there were much more frequent mentions of indigenous organizations in the funding that went to national organizations, indicating that if you first, if you're able to pass that first hurdle of the international agencies, the large multilateral agencies and UN agencies, and get the money into the national context, that indicates that there's a high likelihood that it actually reaches the indigenous organizations. And we also found that there's a lack of mutual accountability and transparency. It mostly is the indigenous organizations that needs to be accountable towards the donors and have transparency towards the donors, not the other way around. And that as a consequence, the indigenous leaders often lack a clear understanding of where the money comes from, what kind of money is available out there, how the different donors operate, and how they channel the funding. Yeah, and donors have increasingly been granting funding for indigenous peoples and local communities tenure and forest management through longer projects over this period of time that we looked at. More of the projects are now 3 years or more, which is a good thing. But there is still a lack of flexibility within the projects. That limits the organizations in communities' ability to respond to challenges and threats that as they arise, and also to seize windows of opportunity as they emerge. So there's a need for more flexibility of funding within these longer-term projects. And ideally, that more of the funding is given as core support to the organizations that they themselves decide how to spend. We also found that there was a lack of gender inclusiveness in the funding. A small share of the funding had a gender components or objectives. Despite the essential role of women in community forest management, and that women are often excluded from governance structures in society. And we found that indigenous peoples face considerable administrative barriers in accessing funding because a lot of the donors, in particular the bilateral donors and the multilateral donors, have very strict eligibility and compliance requirements. And there are few indigenous organizations out there that have the capacity to meet these directly, even though the capacities are improving, and we see that many organizations are now establishing their own funding mechanisms. That is a way of meeting the donors or developing the capacities and the systems that the donor requires to be able to transfer the funding. So there's a need for donors to kind of look critically at their own requirements and see if there's anything that they can do with them, make them lighter, less burdensome on the indigenous organizations, and also because, even though they might not be able to support directly the indigenous organizations, even though they use intermediaries, these intermediaries, be it international NGOs or national NGOs that collaborate with the indigenous organizations, they have to kind of pass on the requirements from the back donor, the bilateral donor or philanthropy for that matter. So they can, even though they're not necessarily able to give funding directly, by easing on their requirements, it would still make it easier both for the intermediary and the indigenous organization. And also it's important that the donors prioritize intermediaries that have close ties to indigenous organizations over time, that can support them in developing capacity and accessing funding.
Thank you so much for that, Torbjörn. Do you feel, I guess the follow-up question is, do you feel that donors are listening? How is your report received? How is your findings being taken in by donor networks and multilaterals and private foundations?
I do think the donors are listening. I mean, looking back to the report we did in 2021, I think the fact that we actually got a IPLC Forest and Tenure Pledge at Glasgow into COP26 was a very good response to our findings. We found that this field, this cause is vastly underfunded, and donors responded by putting up more money, and also recognizing that more money needs to go directly, that they need to support capacity building and amplifying the role of indigenous people. So yeah, I would say they're listening. Also, with this week we saw that the donors issued the first progress report since there's been 1 year after the pledge came. which shows that they're on track to meeting the 1.7 billion target, which is a good thing, and also recognizes that a small share of the overall funding goes directly, and recognizing that that's something they need to work on, but that it takes time. And also in the report, being more open and transparent about what the different donors that have contributing to the pledge, how much they are contributing with, how they are distributing that funding, is also a response to ours and others' call for more transparency. So yeah, there are definitely improvements, and I do feel that the donors are listening, but it's also a case of certain things are easier to change, or takes, and other things take longer time to change. So I think the really what we're wanting to get into here about, really channeling funding to the ground and being more directly, that's kind of the really tricky issue that is going to take longer time to address, and which more actors also need to get involved in on how we really can tackle that issue. But I feel that there is a joint recognition that that is a core issue that we need to work on.
Thank you so much. And moving on to Casey, just following up on Torbjorn's report, I'd love to hear Christensen Fund's approach to how you have been, a leader in the space of direct indigenous funding. I definitely see that the whole focus on rights-based approach is really putting indigenous peoples at the center of decision making. So maybe speak a bit to your approach and also your reflections on this report. And I know that Christensen Fund is one of the members of this $1.7 billion pledge. Give us a look from the inside, how that's coming along, and how your leadership role in that network is, how that's going.
Thanks to TOSA, and thanks to Amazon Sacred Headwaters and to Hub Culture for hosting this important conversation. I think it's a great question, and I think at the Christensen Fund, our guiding document is the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And at the core of that, Indigenous peoples' most important right is the right to self-determination. So we try and go in good relationship, transparent relationships with Indigenous organizations, be good listeners, and give flexible support and step back and get out of the way. And I think the beauty of that is you uphold Indigenous people's right to self-determination through our grant making, but then we have the privileged and honored position to sit back and see how self-determination presents itself in different communities and different regions, because it does look very different. And I think for many years we've been hearing the statistic around, Indigenous peoples are roughly 4 to 5% of the world's population, and it's not by coincidence that they sit on 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity. So it's Indigenous people's ways of life, their traditional knowledge, their ways of being that are in harmony with protecting natural environments and ecosystems. And I'm grateful for the Rainforest Foundation Norway's work on all of this, starting with the Falling Short report in 2021, which highlighted lots of opportunities and challenges around direct funding to Indigenous peoples to protect forests around the world. And that's exactly why the Christensen Fund joined the $1.7 billion pledge in Glasgow at COP26. We are the smallest donor in the pledge, but we are the only rights-based approach donor in the pledge that solely focuses on Indigenous peoples, and that's why we thought it was so critically important that we had a seat at the table. We've had really productive conversations with that donor group, which is called the Forest Tenure Funders Group, which Torbjorn mentioned. They released a report on November 5th here at COP in Egypt, which highlighted lots of good work. And as Torbjorn highlighted, we're on track to meet the pledge requirements, but unfortunately, only 7% of all of the funding to date went directly to Indigenous organizations or local community organizations. That's a single digit number if you did not know. So I hope this time next year at COP28, those numbers will drastically improve. Within that, I can say that the Christensen Fund to date, 78% of our funding in the pledge goes directly to Indigenous-led organizations. And within that, 73% of that funding is completely unrestricted. So now that this report's coming out, we feel like we have an important opportunity to remain being a leader as we talk to bilaterals and other foundations about giving more direct access to funding in a very flexible way.
Great. In New York, there was a launch of Shandia, an Indigenous-led fund, which we had hoped that we'd have representatives today, but weren't able to make it. Speak a little bit about Christensen Fund being, I think, one of the first supporters of Shandia, and how do you see Shandia fitting into this ecosystem of Indigenous-led funding mechanisms?
Yeah, we were very honored and happy to be at the launch of the Shandia Vision, which is a vision coming out of the Global Alliance on Territorial Communities, which is an alliance of 4 of the most important Indigenous organizations, 5 of the most important Indigenous organizations around the globe, protecting, mainly residing in tropical and subtropical forests. So the Shandia Vision is really a vision to put the decision-making processes on resources in the hands of Indigenous peoples. So it's really about supporting a group of very important Indigenous organizations to redistribute funds to themselves in the way that they would like. They have their own funding mechanisms, their own Indigenous-led funds in their own regions that have their own priority. And so the Shandia Vision is an opportunity for philanthropy, governments, resources at large to really decolonize wealth, to put it in the hands of Indigenous peoples and support Indigenous-led funds. And this is why the Christensen Fund is getting behind it in a big way. There's still a lot of development in that vision and deciding how that governance will work, but I think the collaboration amongst the member organizations that are in Shandia is a beautiful opportunity to support Indigenous governance, self-determination, and the reallocation of resources to Indigenous hands. And that's why the Christensen Fund, prior to Shandia, has really prioritized supporting many Indigenous-led funds around the globe.
Great. It's so exciting to see about Shandia and about Christensen Fund, and even this $1.7 billion pledge. I hope it grows and that there's a recognition, like you said, 80% of the world's biodiversity, nearly half of the world's intact forests, and 25% of the world's carbon is in Indigenous stewardship. And so if we really want to see progress on climate, on biodiversity issues, Indigenous peoples funding is key. At the same time, Indigenous peoples are also challenging our worldviews, our way of relating to nature, our redefining development, redefining progress, redefining kind of aspirations of society, and sort of teaching us, sort of guiding our transformation as a species, and also demonstrating models that have the staying power of time. The way, for example, they see harmonious coexistence with nature and the well-being, focus on well-being economies, well-being. So this brings me to our next speaker, who's someone I've worked with since 2000, Domingo Peas, Uyunkar Domingo Peas Nampichkai. He's an Achuar leader from the Ecuadorian Amazon. He's the founder of many Indigenous organizations and initiatives in Ecuador. And for the last 5 years, he's been walking, traversing huge area of what we call the Sacred Headwaters region, uniting Indigenous nations in Ecuador and northern Peru, many of whom are the same nations, just divided by an artificial border, in these bioregion that spans the Napo, Pastaza, Marañón region. Domingo has been bringing communities together around a shared vision. And what I can say is my own experience working in these fields is that for many decades, Indigenous peoples, even the ones that could access funding or access allies, were in competition with one another over funding. Which issue is going to get more press, which issue is going to get more public attention and funding. And really, and what Domingo has tried to espouse as a system of working is to bring alliances together, saying that we need initiatives that lift everyone's boat. We need initiatives that build strength across landscapes and move from competition to cooperation, that together the sum of our parts, the whole is greater than the sum of our parts. And that, through that unity, through that collaboration, we can build larger portfolios, attract greater funding, greater cooperation, and more effectiveness. So I'm really inspired by Domingo, his dedication. He just came back from several weeks through the Peruvian Amazon, helping to unite organizations. And now the Sacred Headwaters has an alliance of 27 organizations, of which 24 are indigenous. And I get to work with Domingo every day, helping to move forward this large vision of protecting the entire bioregion. So I want to welcome Domingo and say, Domingo, maybe we could start with giving us a sense of how the Sacred Headwaters Initiative was born, and what is your hope for the Sacred Headwaters?
Podrías empezar hablando de cómo han nacido las cuencas sagradas y cuál es lo que tú buscas o qué es lo que esperas de las cuencas.
And as someone who's been around many initiatives, has seen many, I've heard you say the Amazon is a great graveyard of many failed initiatives and funding promises, undelivered promises. What is your message for funders and how Indigenous peoples and funders can work better together and be more effective? Both what do funders need to do and what do Indigenous organizations and Indigenous peoples need to do?
Gracias, Atosa. Gracias, Jesús, por la traducción. Y gracias. La verdad, nombre es difícil de todo, solo del Casey. Está fácil. Pero yo quiero felicitar primeramente por vuestro trabajo igual, ese trabajo que están llevando para la protección de los indígenas de la Amazonía. Es también el gran sacrificio que ustedes han puesto y gran voluntad de vuestro personaje.
I want to say thank you to you all and congratulations for the work you're doing. I don't remember everyone's names exactly, but they're difficult for me to pronounce. But I'm really grateful to see your commitment to Indigenous peoples and forests and the Amazon in particular, and say that we value this work so much. And your will and your personal sacrifice that you've made all these years to the issues.
Si fuera empleado, yo estaría ya jubilado. Ya estoy 30 años en proceso organizativo indígena desde el 92 hasta ahora.
And so if I had been employed by the work I've been doing, I would have been retired by now. I started in 1992. I've been in this process of indigenous organizations since 1992 for 30 years now.
Cuencas Sagradas viene por la teoría, la visión de todas las nacionalidades indígenas de la Amazonía ecuatoriana de no extracción petrolera, no maderera, no minera, todas las resoluciones de vuestros congresos.
The Sacred Headwaters vision emerged from the Ecuadorian Amazon, where indigenous peoples all shared similar positions around no extraction of mineral resources, of oil, of logging, the destructive extractive industries. And this was articulated by indigenous peoples for decades in their resolutions, in their congresses, in their declarations.
Nosotros hemos tenido gran confrontación con el gobierno ecuatoriano por este problema, por ser defensores de territorio. Creo que todos los indígenas de todos los países, por rechazo a la extracción, hemos tenido este gran problema.
Indigenous peoples in Ecuador have had significant confrontations with their governments for being for resisting extractive industries, for being defenders of the forest, for defending their territories. And it's not just Ecuador. We see the same pattern throughout the world where indigenous peoples are confronting destruction.
Entonces, esto surge una idea nueva, donde los indígenas, bajo asamblea, una discusión de todos los indígenas de Ecuador, en el Congreso resuelven dar una propuesta al Estado y al mundo. Ahí surge esta idea de la iniciativa Cuencas Sagradas, Territorios de Vida, que es ser post-petrolero, ya olvidar de petróleo, ser una verdadera transición ecológica.
So the idea of the Sacred Headwaters emerged in discussions and assemblies where all the indigenous peoples of Ecuador got together and they said, we need to offer a proposal, an alternative to the current model of development to the world. We need to launch this proposal before the world, and it needs to be from the territories to the world, a vision of ecological transition post-petroleum, being a post-petroleum country, a post-extractive nation, and that's how we began.
Entonces ahí era el primer paso hacer una gran alianza entre indígenas. Todos los 11 nacionalidades.
The first step was to create an alliance among the indigenous peoples of Ecuador. We started with uniting the 11 nations of Ecuador.
Y ustedes sabrán, eso no hay cómo ocultar. Los indígenas, por historia, en todo proceso de desarrollo económico, ha tenido debilidades. Entonces tuve que buscar una alianza externa, otra alianza por parte de la ciudad. Hablemos de lo moderno. Ahí hemos trabajado con 2 fundaciones que históricamente los indígenas han trabajado. Uno de ellos es Amazon Watch, que es reconocido casi por todo lado, y también Fundación Alianza Pachamama y Fundación Pachamama de Ecuador, con quienes hemos trabajado años.
So this was our vision, but we have a lot of weaknesses in the indigenous movement, especially around resources, economic resources, and our ability to present alternatives. And so we decided to unite with the modern world. There we chose 2 long-term allies that we had been working for decades with, and organizations that we had a lot of trust with. One was Amazon Watch, and the other was the Pachamama Alliance and their affiliate, Fundación Pachamama in Ecuador. So we began working with these organizations to develop this idea of the sacred headwaters.
Gracias a ellos hemos trabajado hasta ahora buscando fondos para postular este programa, pero para ser más, si revisamos geográficamente, todos los ríos que nacen en Ecuador, la mayor parte de cabecera, y entre Perú y Ecuador la zona más biodiversa del mundo. Entonces era estratégico hacer alianza también con los indígenas de Perú.
So thanks to these organizations, they helped us look for funding so that we could realize our vision of the sacred headwaters. And we realized that the rivers in most of the Amazon are born in our headwaters in Ecuador, in the mountains of Ecuador, and they run from there into Peru. And so we realized that there is this border, the Peru-Ecuador border, but it really, from a perspective of the region, there is no border. There's just these territories of watersheds that connect. So it was very strategic for us to begin to work with our counterparts on the Peruvian side of the border.
Entonces, eso también ha sido con una aprobación de organizaciones representativas como COICA, que es parte de 9 países. Hemos firmado convenio con AIDC Perú para poder aunar esfuerzo con los territorios indígenas. Por eso hemos respetado todas las estructuras organizativas, aprobado por todas las nacionalidades, y se crea esta aprobación conjunta. Y hoy en día ya hemos hecho diagnóstico de estudio para hablar técnicamente, económicamente, cuáles son los problemas sociales, problemas económicos, y ya tenemos construido un plan bioregional.
So in order to expand our alliance, we went through all of the proper channels of the organic structures of indigenous organizations. We began with COICA, who is the indigenous organization of all of the 9 countries of the Amazon basin. Through COICA, we also signed a memorandum of understanding with IDESEP, the indigenous organization of the Peruvian Amazon, and together we formed this consortium of Ecuador, Peru, through COICA, so IDESEP, CONFENIAI, and COICA, to begin to really have consensus around our vision. We began to do a lot of diagnostics. So what are the problems we're trying to address? We spent years doing studies, technical studies, financial studies, economic studies to see the problems of the region, and then to also look for solutions. We basically built a bioregional plan. For the last 5 years, we've been building the bioregional plan that looks at both the problems and the solutions.
Bueno, quiero resumir para no cansarles lo más importante, diría yo, es que este programa se va a convertir a una institución, porque la alianza que hemos hecho nos han dicho ya hagan lo propio. O sea, toca hacer institución legal formal para que este fondo, así como todos estamos coincidiendo, queremos que el fondo no venga a través de fundaciones, sino directo para los indígenas y canalizar fondo directo a los territorios. Y aquí hemos hecho una alianza para poder garantizar la existencia y la eficaz del manejo económico. Hemos hecho el 70% de gobernanza, de gobernabilidad de esta institución va a ser indígena. Pero también seguimos buscando más aliados, cooperantes, voluntarios, porque queremos ser eficientes. En esto es que queremos ser una integración, una participación para que en el futuro los indígenas no caigan en la trampa administrativa económica.
So it's important to say that this program is been held with these allies, but what we decided as an organization that the initiative, the Sacred Headwaters Initiative, is going to become its own institution. That we've been grateful for the funding channeling through our NGO allies, but now we're ready to create our own institution, our own fund, our own mechanism of indigenous governed organization that helps to directly channel funding to the ground, to indigenous peoples. That this alliance needs to grow. Of course, it's not going to be just indigenous peoples. While we see this new institution being at least 70% governed by indigenous people, we are looking for growing our allies, cooperation agencies, funders, technical people, volunteers, people who have the will to support us to integrate into a joint initiative that's mostly indigenous peoples, but also has technical and allies involved, so that indigenous peoples don't fall into the trap that they normally fall into with their weakness to administer large sums of money and report on it. And so that there is cooperation and joint efforts for ensuring the success of the initiative.
Como esta visión es tan grande, el eje número 1 es la gobernanza indígena. Los indígenas deben gobernar en su territorio. El eje 2 es también la conectividad, ¿ya? Es importantísimo esto. Queremos emprender la bioeconomía, porque si no hacemos planes de programas de emprendimiento, con esta globalización los indígenas también ya están alocando a atacar su hábitat. Lo otro importante también es energía limpia. Tenemos que trabajar ya, olvidar ya en la Amazonía lo que es combustible, concentrar en lo que es energías renovables. Queremos hacer trabajos ¿cómo se llama? De restauración, reforestación, donde hay ya Amazonías por petroleros, por mineros, están contaminados, hay gente que no tiene que tomar de agua. Entonces queremos concentrar ese trabajo, porque tenemos que queremos sanarlo, porque ya está contaminado en ciertos lugares, en Ecuador, en Amazonía Norte, en Amazonía Sur, en Zamora está lleno de minería. El gobierno está cada día licitando este trabajo. pero hemos sentado con ministros de medio ambiente para ver cómo trabajar juntos. No queremos pelear, queremos crear nueva política. En vez de confrontación, sentarnos como ecuatorianos, lanzar esta propuesta al mundo, porque la Amazonía es vida para la humanidad.
So within our vision of the Sacred Headwaters, we have some key strategic pathways. The first priority is around building stronger governance of Indigenous peoples governing their territories. Not just governance of the initiative, but the governance in territories. That's one of the key investment areas that we're needing to invest. The second is to consolidate our connectivity, our alliance, the fact that we are building this large connected alliance. The third area is the area of bioeconomy, because if we don't provide support for livelihood and alternatives, the indigenous peoples themselves start to attack their own forest for basic necessities. And so that's a key area that we hope to deliver. The fourth is clean energy, the fact that we need to change our energy matrix and help communities have clean, renewable energy. Fifth is to really look at restoration and reforestation. There are huge areas of this landscape that are contaminated by oil drilling, by mining. For example, in the north of Ecuador, there's contamination. In the southern part of Ecuador, in Zamora, there's mining contamination. And these are areas where communities don't have drinking water, don't have clean water to drink. We need to prioritize meeting the basic needs of communities for their basic needs like water. And lastly, we want to sit with the government. We've told the government, we've met with the Minister of Environment and the Ministry of Environment, and we've said repeatedly, we want to work together to push forward this alternative vision of ecological transition. We don't just want to fight. We're kind of done as fighting. We want to pose alternative solutions that are in the benefit of everyone, because we're not just protecting the forest for ourselves, we're protecting it for all of humanity.
Yo creo que el punto más importante que en toda mi trayectoria veo es que sí ha habido debilidad de competencia. En el mundo que he caminado durante 30 años, ONGs también, cada cual busca sus socios para trabajar, para captar fondos. He visto instancias grandes, también los indígenas, cada cual corre para buscar su fondo y no ha sido eficaz. Entonces, por eso era esta para que seamos un solo equipo. Pero ahora escucho de Shanda, estuve en Nueva York, sí, y hace 3 días también había otro lanzamiento entre Venezuela, Perú y Colombia. Yo hablé con ellos estos días porque no podemos entre hermanos hacer competencia para ver quién arranca más, sino cómo empatar juntos. Y los aliados también, súper claro, la alianza es necesario, la alianza internacional, ONGs, deben ser nuestros aliados, asesores técnicos, económicos, incluso políticos, pero esto debemos hacer de corazón. Yo sí soy sincero, hay muchos jóvenes que quieren, no importa cómo, pero quieren dinero. Yo no estoy a ese nivel. Yo ya estoy para jubilar. Entonces quiero garantizar el fondo para los territorios de todos los autogobiernos. Solo así vamos a frenar este gran problema del climático.
Yeah. So what I've seen in my 30 years walking the forests and being in this movement is that we've had some weaknesses, specifically because we've been in competition with each other over funding. The big NGOs run their own campaigns to raise money. Each indigenous organization is competing, running around trying to raise money. That this hasn't been efficient. It's been a lot of work for very little results, and the results haven't been there. what I see is that we need to consolidate and become united in developing our fundraising strategy together. I was in New York for the launch of Shandia, and I think it's important the work that the Alliance is doing internationally. I was also just here this week, heard about a new fund that was being launched with Venezuela and Colombia, and with the Colombia and Peru, and see that as also an important. And I said to both of these organizations that let's work together. Let's form a super alliance. That we also need to bring in the NGO allies. We need them to be our economic allies, funders, but also political allies with advocacy and public policy. But we need to do it with trust and from our hearts. I see many young, ambitious Indigenous people who are just wanting to get the money and for their own initiatives. But what I see as important is our goal should be to help each Indigenous territory have their own fund, eventually have their own fund for their own self-government. And we need to do this together so that the problems that we're facing can be solved together.
Quiero concluir. Yo creo que vuestro tiempo es muy, muy importante. Agradecer nuevamente. Yo quiero que vuestro esfuerzo que están haciendo, el informe de usted más que todo, sobre este fondo que no llega, es verdad. Nosotros lo sabemos. O sea, el Estado ha tenido apoyo, otros medios de gobierno a gobierno, pero nunca ha llegado al territorio. Eso sí es verdad. Y ahora va a seguir lo mismo. Es por eso este programa que estamos lanzando. Queremos también nuestras voces estén en todos los niveles, ¿ya? Con acompañamiento técnico, asesoramiento económico de nuestros aliados internacionales. Y quisiera que nos sigan acompañando. Esa conexión no lo tenemos nosotros. Yo estoy aquí gracias a Tosa, gracias a Bill, gracias a otros. Y eso necesitamos todos los indígenas. Pero sí hay que estructurar una confianza absoluta. Yo lo llamo así, trabajemos de corazón. Mente abierta a dónde vamos. El problema mundial es de todo, no es solo de indígenas. Entonces es hora de que al menos los que somos conscientes trabajemos a ese nivel. Es difícil impulsar esto, pero no imposible. ¿Sí? Entonces yo todavía tengo más ánimo de seguir hasta que me dé fuerza, y ahí necesito vuestro acompañamiento, no solo a mí, a los indígenas, en general. Eso sería mi llamado. Porque solamente unidos, aliados de dos mundos diferentes, sin ver los colores, vamos a tener camino largo y un éxito en todo el trabajo para la nueva generación.
Gracias, Domingo. So lastly, I want to conclude. I know how valuable your time is. I want to thank you again for your efforts. I want to say that especially thank you, Rainforest Foundation Norway, for this report that you put out. I can concur with your report's findings. It's true, funding doesn't arrive. Often we see government-to-government cooperation, lots of funding that gets passed on from one government to another and never reaches the ground. And that's why I think we need to bring our voices together and our efforts together. That together is, we need the allyship, we need the technical support and advising of our international allies. I'm here because people like Atosa and Belen and Bill have been helping provide me with support and access to bring my message to the front. And so every Indigenous organization needs this. But we need to structure structures of allyship that is based on trust and from the heart. We need to basically bring our hearts, minds, and intellects together in trustful ways to move forward the solutions, because no one's going to be able to alone solve the crisis that we face. This work is hard. To build allyship and alliances and partnerships is hard, but it's not impossible. And only through becoming united, that we can find pathways forward for the next generation. Thank you. Gracias, Domingo. Muchas gracias. I wanted to just say, open it up to you all, and Stan, of course, if you have any questions around what's been shared, and just have a few minutes of discussion. Let's see, we're almost out of time, huh?
Yeah, well, we have more time in this room,
Okay,
so we can have the Q&A if you want.
maybe another 5
We
to
have
5
time
minutes.
because
Yeah.
we're good.
Okay, so just a few minutes of conversation, questions, reflections.
I mean, from our point of view, this is very interesting, and also to see the priorities that you are identifying for the growth and the strengthening of the alliance.
Siempre hay que escuchar las prioridades que tú identificas para fortalecer la alianza.
And we have many technologies within hub culture, which we have been talking to Atosa about how to make them specifically relevant for these types of communities.
Tecnología en hub culture y estamos hablando con Atosa para ver cómo hacerlas disponibles para estas comunidades.
So perhaps we'll give a proposal to Atosa.
Vamos a
I think we can help you build some of this with our technologies and give it to the headwaters to operate, but to help you on the technical side with some of these tools, especially governance, because we have an incredible governance system that we've built for thousands of hubs around the world. And if you could apply the hub model to each community, we can give you some incredible, very valuable tools.
Tenemos mucha experiencia con la gobernanza. Entonces,
Can you give an example of that?
Yeah, so inside hub culture, anyone can open a hub, and we have a system of governance where an administrator or a participant can create a rule, like a principle, a policy, or what we call a plank, and then the rest of the participants in the hub can vote on that rule. So we can give you digital governance, and any group can create their own governance, and then they can share the best practices to other groups, and it's all essentially able to be used in a way that the community is deciding the rules for their own group. So it can be very diverse from place to place.
en nuestra plataforma alguien puede sugerir una regla y la gente puede votar y lo acepta. Entonces es una forma que se facilita la tecnología contando en cuanto al
One other thing that I think is very important to this conversation, which Atosa has been helping me with even this week, is the importance of the commons. So we have some capabilities to create commons that can be effectively funded, but more importantly, we've developed this idea of identity for place. So all the way down to a tree or even to an area of land, you could establish guardianship of land. So we use mapping system, you establish guardianship, and then become a guardian of this land. And the nature itself can become the kind of entity. So instead of having a company, you can look at creating support for places. So if there's a river, or if there's a lake, or if there's an area of forest, we can create an identity for that. And then this can be interlinked with person and tribe and country in very granular ways. Does it make sense?
All on the digital platform, this idea
On
of
the digital, yeah.
I think I got it. In the platform.
It's the frontier of technology.
It is. But place-based identity. So we think about human identities. We're thinking now about location-based identity. But then, the harbor can become something that is protected, and then you have guardians around this. So the tribe can become the guardian of the place.
Sounds cool. Es en frontera de tecnología, como tecnología en mapeo puede hacer como en el mundo digital una protección permanente de un lugar. Por ejemplo, territorio Achuar, territorio Xaramensa puede ser su propia identidad.
Ese manejo necesita todas las nacionalidades. Yo creo que sí, podemos seguir conversando. Próximo año vamos a crear una escuela de liderazgo para la próxima generación. Y primer curso de un año, ahí podríamos instalar este programa para capacitar a esos jóvenes mujeres.
Posible a participar.
Ajá.
So next year, let's keep talking about this. We're in the process of starting a new leadership training school for the Sacred Headwaters called the Living Amazon School. And there we have a 1-year program to train young people around the ideas of the bioregional plan. And here we can put together a module on how these kinds of technologies can help support protection
We'd
of
love to
this
support
territory.
that. And we can also take this to other companies and technology companies to be involved.
I don't know, Torbjörn, if you
Yeah.
have some.
No, I just want to emphasize how important I think Domingo's words about presenting an alternative vision of development, how important that is, and also building broad alliances around those visions, because basically the problem we're facing here is that us as humanity not anywhere near valuing enough the value of the importance of the rainforest and the value it provides us, and trading it off for short-term profit, basically. So building broad alliances around the importance of the rainforest, and also alliances that can tie together large areas of rainforest, like you have done with the Amazon Sacred Headwaters, which is basically and its impact way beyond these forests. But also because even these core areas of forest, they also depend on the forest beyond them again, and we also need to make sure that those forests are protected, because this is a vast ecosystem that depends on being vast. I mean, we need to keep the Amazon as this massive forest, and we're dangerously close to what scientists talk about a tipping point for the Amazon, both because of climate change and deforestation and degradation. So we need to look at large areas of indigenous territories, because they I think something like 25% of the Brazilian Amazon, at least, and I don't know about the figures in the other countries, are under indigenous recognized territories. But we also need to look at the forest beyond those territories and develop alliances and strategies that can keep them protected as well, also for the sake of the indigenous peoples and their territories, because they depend on the forests outside of these territories to keep the forest inside the territories protected and healthy and functioning. And also your points about avoiding competition is extremely important. It doesn't benefit anyone that that NGOs or indigenous organizations or anyone else just looking out for their own small piece of the pie. We need to grow the pie, and we need to coordinate better and make sure that all that money is well spent, and because we are not, there's no point in us competing with each other. We have enough competing with the outside world that do not share our vision for the future. So I think those are very, very important points.
Thank you.
Yeah, if I could just add, I think Amazon Sacred Headwaters and all that you've co-created, Domingo, with many leaders across Ecuador and Peru is a beautiful example of indigenous collaboration, of supporting indigenous governance systems to protect territories, and further kind of positioning yourself to institutionalize the alliance to accept funding and support your member organizations across the northern Amazon. In particular, I think Sacred Headwaters is a great example of an indigenous-led process, redistribution of funds in an indigenous way, which very much would be an indigenous-led fund. And I think we must address this concern about capacity. And I don't agree with capacity, I like using infrastructure, because indigenous peoples have capacity, they have a lot of capacity, and so do donors, but it has to go both ways, right? All too often we focus that indigenous peoples and local community organizations don't have the capacity to receive funding. Well, part of the problem is the donors. So we need to work together on how to kind of share information and work together on how we can strengthen our processes and make them a bit more agreeable and flexible for each other.
Well, as we come to a close, I just want to thank everyone for their participation in today's panel, and to say that I leave here hopeful that greater understanding, matched with our commitments and the urgency, will find pathways that are win-win for all. I love the idea that Christensen Fund is supporting general support, allows for Indigenous peoples to articulate their own needs. And I really think that what I've been witnessing at the Sacred Headwaters is this idea of Indigenous peoples having to make decisions together about their shared priorities, but also supporting each other's emergencies and each other, recognizing when one community is affected by an oil spill or one community is affected by an urgent crisis, how they need to rally around each other internally. And so I really am excited about the work. I'm excited about Shandi. I'm really excited about the work you're doing, Rainforest Foundation, to make visible the patterns of funding, because only through this feedback loop can we make change. So thank you all for today's conversation, and we'll continue on and look forward to working with Hub Culture on technical solutions to make visible some of the governance and funding prioritization. So thank you, everybody.
Gracias también. Es importante lo que dice, cada cual sabe su mundo. Ustedes saben lo suyo, lo que es economía moderna. Nosotros los amazónicos sabemos lo nosotros. Lo que queremos es intercalar conocimientos y todos juntos buscar el mejor camino. Yo lo llamo crear nuevo barco para que todos podamos salvar la vida. Así es que gracias, estimados, yo estoy muy contento. Queremos este tipo de reunión seguir avanzando con vuestro apoyo, con más personajes, para que el trabajo sea más rápido, más dinámico y más eficiente.
So just to conclude, I'm really grateful for today. I think that you're experts in your modern world. We're experts in our world. We have our own economy, our own ways. And what we need now is to interweave our knowledge, our technical expertise, and to basically, I say, create a new ship, a new ark, where we all board the new ark to save life. And that hopefully these conversations continue. I would love to see these conversations grow. I'd love to see more people engage in these conversations, so that we can come together and accelerate the rate of change and become more effective, because we have a lot to do. So thank you so much.
Gracias.
Thank you, Domingo.
Gracias.
Jesus for translating. Yeah.